Welcome to our second seminar in our series of World Printers Forum webinars, webinar, not seminar, of WAN-IFRA. I want to introduce Inge Olafsson, the director of the World Printers Forum, who will moderate the webinar. Our webinar today is entitled Newspaper Production in Times of COVID-19. Inge, could you take over?
Yes, thank you, Anton. Thanks for this. Was Anton Tolkowsky. He is our managing editor of the Insights department. He will be with me on the webinar today. We're trying to connect with Dr. Rick Stunt, who is going to be our speaker today. We're having a wee bit of a technical problem, so bear with us. He should be here in a minute, and I can tell you a little bit about Rick before he enters, or at least before we present the speaker. I just want to mention that WAN-IFRA has a series of webinars planned, and we have already given some webinars about this COVID-19 crisis. And you can look at that in our events column on our webpage. And I would advise you to look at that, and everybody must know our webpage, WAN-IFRA.org. I also urge you to sign up for our media panel, where you can gain instant insights into the news media business. That's also WAN-IFRA.org/global_panel. We will send all these things out. Also, I'd like to draw your attention to, because of the quite big portion of world streaming now in these crises, there might be some technical difficulties like these we're having. Anton, do we have him online?
I'm sorry, Inge. He does not seem to be online.
He doesn't seem to be online. Okay.
Just a moment. Let me see. It looks like he might have just joined.
Then I'm as an attendee.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
He's there. I'll tell him a little bit about you, Rick. Our speaker today is Dr. Rick Stunt, and he is the group paper director for the dmg-Media in London. He holds a PhD in chemical physics. He is the former chairman of the World Printers Forum board, as well as being a board member of WAN-IFRA. He's the chair of NIMC, the Newspaper Industry Raw Materials Committee in the UK, as well as he's chairing Paper and Environmental Working Group for the NME, the News Media Europe. He is also an executive director on board of two sites. Like I mentioned before, he will talk about logistics in times of COVID-19 and address also concerns about the paper being spreading the virus. Dr. Stunt will talk about 10-15 minutes. Then we will open the floor for questions. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions. There is a Q&A panel where you can post your questions. Please do so in the box, and we will address them then for ask Dr. Stunt about it. We're very honored to have you here today, Dr. Stunt. The floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me? Hello,
yes,
can you hear me? Oh, good. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and sorry about the confusion earlier on. I've got a new laptop, and the Zoom app wasn't working very well, so I tried to use my old Nokia phone to call in. Of course, that's not the right technology, so I've got an iPhone here, which is now working. So welcome to this short webinar that WAN-IFRA is organising to address the concerns around newsprint during these difficult times. And as my introduction says, my name's Rick Stunt. I've worked for the dmg-Media group, previously known as Associated Newspapers, for just over 26 years now, mainly as their group paper director, although I'm responsible for other materials as well. Our titles include the Daily Mail that you probably know of, the Mail on Sunday, and the Metro, the Free Sheet in London. And as previously explained, I also served and am serving on various national and international materials committees. And I thank WAN-IFRA for asking me to give this short talk about the concerns of newsprint in terms of availability and other aspects of it. And I'd like to break it down into two areas. It won't be a long chat. I think most of the benefit will be in the discussions afterwards. So the two areas are the production, the inventory and availability of newsprint for printing during this crisis. And the second point is the safety concerns around using newsprint as a substrate for newspapers and whether or not this can transfer the COVID-19 virus from surface to hands, etc. Okay, so I'll start on the production of newsprint, and most of my comments are centered on various discussions I've had with most of the producers in Europe and Canada, and most of these suppliers are known to you, and probably most of you use one or some or all of them. In terms of the raw materials that mills need to use, all mills assure me that when it comes to the recycled fibre availability, or PFR, the fibre availability is continuing to be very, very good. Mills can have access to it. They don't see any issues around acquiring the raw material. And in fact, in the UK in particular, the two newsprint mills that we have, Shotton and Palm, have got key personnel status on the back of the fact that they are recycling units as well as newsprint producers. So we don't see any issues around raw material, secondary fibre raw material. And equally, when I've spoken to mills that use some or all of their furnished through virgin fibre, they are currently confident they can access all the raw material that they need and don't foresee any shortages coming up with regards to that. All other inputs that mills use, energy, water, chemicals, etc., they also remain unaffected. So in terms of the raw materials required to make the paper, there are no issues foreseen coming up. When it comes to the physical production at the mills, all the mills are following the WHO COVID-19 guidelines with regard to the hygiene, hand washing, keeping personnel apart by 2 or 3 meters, whatever it is. In fact, I mean, most mills, when you think about it, they're large size and the physical throughput of material, they have a relatively low number of workers in comparison to the size of the operations, and this lends itself to isolation. Most mills are organised around a 5 or 6 shift system on a 24/7 basis. And the manufacturing process itself lends itself to compartmentalisation because if you think about it, most mills, goods inwards, fibre, pulp production, the paper making, finishing, the wrapping and distributions are all separate departments. And whereas under normal conditions, they would probably have a production meeting once a day for all of these guys or heads meet up. I'm sure at the moment that these are all done by remote access to obviously to reduce the chances of any infection. When it comes to after the paper's made, logistics and distribution, most mills, when they serve their home markets, will distribute mainly by road traffic and occasionally within larger countries by rail. I'm assured that at the moment there are no long-term problems envisaged going forward. As infections go up, drivers will be less available, but the thinking is that the availability of drivers will ensure that these materials can be transported, not least of which most countries have given newsprint and paper a special status with regard to publishing and newspaper, the freedom of speech, etc. Where deliveries are going across borders by trucks, we're not seeing any serious hold-ups at the moment, and we don't expect to see them because the borders are chiefly concerned with members of the public and people going across borders rather than goods and trucks. There might be some delay, but we're not expecting massive delays. When it comes to exports, particularly countries like the UK that are reliant on newsprint to come into it, and other markets that are also reliant, most mills transfer or traffic this material via designated paper ships. So we don't expect any hold-ups of trucks at ports and things like the Channel Tunnel for the UK, because that paper just simply isn't, or newsprint in particular, simply isn't transported that way. Again, we don't see any difficulties currently with relation to any traffic of goods. When it comes to availability, as I said, there's good availability through ongoing production at the newsprint mills. But in terms of the mill inventories that are currently out, I think at the end of February, according to Eurograph, there are very healthy inventories of some 320,000 tons plus of stock, which represents around 26 publishing days of supply, which is currently manufactured and made and available. So there's good availability for that. So in summary, the paper producers have worked hard to ensure that there is continuity of production and availability. And aside from one or two mills that have some incidents at the moment, which we can talk about later, full industry integrity has been assured through the hard work of the mills. And I'm sure that most of us, of our customers here, have had various communications from their suppliers outlining the measures they've taken, and we're all thankful for that. So that's really the side for newsprint availability. And as I say, in summary, at the moment, no huge causes for concern there. Moving on to the aspects that a lot of people are interested in, that is our newspapers made of newsprint safe to read during this COVID-19 epidemic. Well, firstly, it might be useful just a brief description of what a virus is, because some people seem to think viruses are alive, and they're not that type of thing. They don't live as we understand living. It's basically an infective agent which is made up of nucleic acids. Think of like an RNA or a DNA complex molecule, which is normally covered in a protein coat. It's very small. It's typically 100 to maybe 500 times smaller than a single bacteria cell. So you're talking about a very small thing here. As I said before, it's not alive, and it replicates itself by living in a living host or a cell. And the viability of the virus, and when I say the viability, I'm talking about the actual molecule that makes up the virus. It is a molecule more than anything else. It can be destroyed by either destroying the protein coating it has, or you can denature the actual RNA or DNA with alcohol as well. With this current virus, coronaviruses do change, and I don't profess to be an expert in any way, shape, or form about epidemiology, but this particular virus is thought with the experience of China and other countries over the last few months to spread primarily through droplet breath transmission through air, if you like, with proximity to other people. It's thought that the COVID-19, it's possible that you can pick it up from surfaces, but it's not considered to be the main pathway of infection with this particular coronavirus. In fact, the WHO, WHO has said that they made a comment on packaging and cardboard, and they've said WHO themselves that whether it's safe to receive a package from an area where COVID-19 has been reported, WHO has said the likelihood of an infected person contaminating commercial goods is low, and the risk of catching the virus that causes COVID-19 from a package that has been moved, traveled and exposed to different conditions and temperature is also very low. So when you think about the packaging here, you can almost think of a newspaper as packaging. So as far as the WHO are concerned, there's a very, very low possibility that these viruses could be transferred by handling packaging or newspapers. So where are we now? Yeah. So further studies have been done on how viruses can interact with various surfaces, because clearly with newspaper, the concern about newspapers is how the virus reacts with regard to sitting on the surface of newsprint. And a lot of studies have been done about viruses in the past on different aspects of surfaces. Generally speaking, the best surface has been found to be copper, where the virus itself is viable, has a half-life viability of 4 hours. I think in half-life they mean that after 4 hours, half the virus is left able to replicate itself. This is presumably down to the fact that copper has very, very pronounced antimicrobial properties. And if you think about that, think about brass door handles in the past. Brass alloys were used for handles because they had very, very high antimicrobial properties, which stems from the copper. Other studies have also shown that where copper is the first, for the shortest lifetime, cardboard and paper is the second, and typically half-lives there are 18 hours to 24 hours, and this is thought to be due to the porous nature of cardboard and in particular paper. If you think of the earlier comments about how small these viruses are in comparison to single cell life, that they will fall through these networks and they will find it themselves. They will find themselves much more difficult to translocate themselves from one surface to another. Typically, other surfaces that we come into contact, plastics and smooth metals, etc., it's been shown that the viruses can stay viable for up to 9 days with these surfaces. So in comparison to the majority of surfaces, paper has a fairly low lifetime rate with these kind of viruses, which is good. If you consider how the newspapers themselves get into the environment, I mean, newspapers are produced in press rooms which have a very high level of automation. So when you look at newsprint reels made into newspapers, folded and then distributed into news agents and also into direct letterboxes in Europe, outside of the actual person delivering the newspaper, presumably wearing gloves these days, there is no interaction with human touch at all for 99.9% of the copy. So it has a very low incidence of human touch. And newspapers themselves, when you think of them, they're printed in an industrial process with chemicals and inks. Inks themselves, as we know, are antimicrobial because of the way that they're constructed to reduce infection in press rooms themselves. And of course, the benefit that those inks give us in production in press rooms are also transferred to the printed copy itself. They don't stop being effective antimicrobial agents. So, I mean, in conclusion, in terms of the virus itself on the newspapers as a surface, there's never been any incidents recorded, to my knowledge, and certainly no evidence that anybody's actually caught the virus from a newspaper or magazine. The scientific research that's abounds, and we can all look this up on Google ourselves if we wish to, shows that inanimate surfaces with quite porous structures such as newsprint has a very low potential to transfer the viruses, and also the viruses themselves are viable for much shorter periods of time on our surfaces than other surfaces. As I said before, newspapers are very sterile, mainly because of the process they go through and the inks they use. And lastly, of course, publishers at print plants are using the same WHO guidelines as those people in paper mills. So we're making sure precautions are taken at all the print plants, distribution centres, and newsstands and home deliveries. And that's it. So that's the end of my sort of formal chat. Can you hear me still?
Sure.
Hello.
Yeah.
So that sort of concludes my sort of formal chat. If we want to go on to any questions now.
Yeah, we're getting some questions into our questions column, and I just start here with one that is: does the coronavirus affect the newsprint demand? Is the demand shrinking because of newspapers are restructuring their products?
So I didn't quite understand the question. What was the question again?
I think it's about the demand. Is the demand going down or are is the volume going up for newspapers? Are people buying more papers, or is the volume going down? So is the demand going up and down, or down?
I can just talk about our own group in the UK, and if you think about it, our group publish a number of different products across the ranges. So we publish paid-for newspapers, and we also publish free newspapers. And we found, obviously, with the free newspapers in London, which are the Metro, which we own, and the Evening Standard, which is an afternoon paper, that clearly their distribution, their circulation, which is free distribution, is obviously affected by footfall. So at the moment, the Metro itself, which is the biggest newspaper in the UK in terms of circulation, has had to reduce its output. So it's gone from maybe 1.5 million down to a third of that, 500,000, because the footprint is just not there. And I think similar things have happened with the Evening Standard. They've reduced their output by 10-20%. They've also announced that they will probably start distributing delivering it to households directly, which will be quite interesting. But both together, clearly, there's going to be an impact on newsprint consumption with free newspapers there, and whether it's 30 or 40 or 50 or 60%, it's going to be a pretty significant reduction in consumption free of those large distributed newspapers in London. When it comes to the paid-for circulations, we're finding that they're holding up pretty strongly, actually. And I think going forward, it really depends on how, particularly in the UK, how members of the public can get access to buying newspapers. Typically in the UK, newspapers are very few are delivered into letterboxes. Most people go out to the shop or newsagent get their papers there. I know it's slightly different in Europe, where papers are actually delivered in, but in the UK, people mainly go and get them themselves. So we're basically saying, yeah, maybe they're holding up pretty stable. I mean, outside of the usual sort of -8% annual sort of pattern we have at the moment, they're holding up. So overall, I think, in combination with the free newspapers, we'll see some downward pressure on demand, that's for sure. And whether or not it continues as more and more of society is told to isolate remains to be seen. I think we can safely assume that newsprint consumption is going to take a bit of a hit over the next 2 or 3 months. Yes.
Thank you for that. Here's another one that I find quite amusing. This is from Gary Cullum. He says, an 85-year-old former Westminster Press MD asked me a question about the virus on paper. He's ironing every page of his daily Telegraph each day before reading it. Should he continue to do so? Obviously, he's doing it based on the reports that the virus is dying at 26 or 27 degrees temperature. Should he continue to iron his paper?
Well, it's an interesting one. That, I mean, I'd say I'm not an expert, but if you look at, there's an expectation that when we get into warmer climates, warmer temperatures as spring goes on, that the virus falls away, because in the traditional flu season is in the colder months, and it tends to fall away in the warmer months. That may be not so true when you consider that this virus is in areas such as Dubai and places like that, which are very hot. They still have big problems there with the virus. But yeah, in terms of temperature, of course, what happens with the temperature, I'm led to believe, is that the temperature will destroy the proteins surrounding the virus, so the virus becomes less able to remain to keep its integrity. So there's science behind that. I'm not so sure ironing it won't do it any harm, I suppose. Talking about that, one of my father's next door neighbour, at the moment, is doing the reverse. He's actually putting his paper in the freezer for an hour before he takes it out. He's convinced that works. But in all seriousness, if you go back to what I've just said, if you look at the evidence and the science behind the viruses and how they sit on these surfaces, it tends to suggest that there's very, very, very limited possibility that you can actually pick up viruses from printed surfaces.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. I just wanted to mention that we have 100+ participants in the webinar today, which is it's a great number, and they're from all over the world. So we're very happy about that. And by all means, spread the word, because we will have another webinar next week, and we will start to publish that tomorrow as well. Here's another question about the COVID-19. In some central and southwestern European countries, it seems that the recovered paper collection rates worsened due to COVID-19. Have you heard of that?
No, I mean, I've spoken to most mills, and they're saying that they're currently getting a good supply of secondary fibre. Well, and it seems to, and as I say, in the UK, the mills, our two newsprint mills here in the UK, have got special worker status because they are actually in the recycling business. So at least in terms of the UK government, they identify it as a very important process that has to be supported. So are they actually saying that there's less collection as a result of the coronavirus, or? Yeah, I think it depends on. I mean, obviously, there are many ways of collecting secondary fibre in the UK. Most local authorities have a collection system where they go to households and collect door to door. And we do have some, not many, local authorities that have a bring system. I would imagine that in those countries that would have a bring system where the members of the public take their old newspapers and magazines to a central point, I would imagine that they would be less inclined to do that in terms of the virus and the lockdown at the moment. Whereas we here with collections, where trucks come around and physically collect it from your bins outside your door, I don't think that's not been impacted, at least not in the UK anyway. Yeah. But in terms of the mills, and I've spoken to most of them, not the individual mills, but of course the groups, there's been no negative comment about the availability of secondary fibre, no.
Here's another one from Pedro in Latin America. In Brazil and Latin America, most tabloids and free papers are not delivered to subscribers, but only available on newsstands. 2 of them have ceased printing in Brazil this week alone. Does DMG plan to suspend Metro while lockdown lasts? How hard can this impact you mentioned be on particular format of newspaper?
Format in terms of what? In terms of what, being a free newspaper?
Yeah, I think he means the Metro papers, the free papers.
Well, as I said, I mean, we've obviously in our group our own Metro, which is distributed to around 12 cities in the UK. It's had a massive impact upon us. Clearly, we're a larger group with quite well resourced. So, and the Metro itself, our product is very profitable. So we hope, as and when normality returns, things will be roughly the same. But in terms of other newspaper groups where you know their Metro type papers might be less robust, it's a big concern, isn't it? It's a concern that whether the business model can continue if footprint doesn't come back pretty quickly. Yeah, that's what he means in terms of the format. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Yep. Is there a danger that present reduced volumes may have a lasting effect, as previous newspapers buyers now staying at home and will get used to getting the news online and perhaps not revert to the hard copy when this is all over?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm not a publisher, but it's everybody's concern that there's a rule of thumb that if you change your behaviour in any way for more than 6 weeks, it becomes ingrained, I think. And if this lockdown certainly goes on for 2 or 3 months, then obviously there is a big concern that those people that haven't got access or able to go and buy newspapers will get out of the habit, for sure. Yeah, I mean, that's a very big concern that everybody has. Every publisher has that concern. Yeah. I think one of the aspects of this is online newspapers seem to be being consumed even more aggressively at the moment, which kind of bears out the concern of that question raiser. That yeah, it could well change human behaviour going forward to the negative for printed newspapers. Oh.
There's another one. At least one mill stopped production due to COVID-19. Do you have a view on the balance on offer and demand?
Well, there's been a few stories going about. The initial story was that Chapelle Darblay had ceased production because one of its workers had the virus, but in fact that was turned out to be incorrect. That was down to a power line that was knocked out of action, and that's the reason why that mill went down. The second piece of news was that Golbey, which is owned by Norske Skog, one of their machines is down because one of their operatives in the winding team had gone down with the virus, and as the guidelines laid down by the French government dictate, they had to stop production there and clean everything down and suspend operations for a period of time. So that's actually true, but that's just that the reason why it stopped is because the mill had to fulfil the obligations set up by the French government. So it ceased production for a period of time. There is one instance of another mill in the UK, Caledonian, which is a coated mill, has stopped production, and that was down. That was by virtue of the fact they had actually closed down for a maintenance stop for a couple of weeks. They'd gone to restart, but they found that a lot of their staff have had to self-isolate for various reasons, including other health reasons. So they didn't have a core amount of experience to restart the mill. So that mill is now also down, but not because of coronavirus, but indirectly because of coronavirus, if you like. So most mills that I've spoken to are very hopeful they can continue production, but of course, as and when staff do get infected, it depends on what the local government, local national government dictators, what the factories have to do, of course. So yeah, it's just be vigilant. And as I said earlier on in my chat, that one of the advantages of graphic paper and newsprint production is that you've got large factories with massive amount of throughput, with relatively few people actually working in the plant. So it lends itself to this to more isolation. So we're hoping that the virus can be contained. And also, of course, the other thing to consider is that it seems to be that this current virus has less integrity in hot, humid climates, actually, as opposed to hot, dry climates. So hot, humid climate is exactly where the paper mills are. I mean, when they operate in those hot, sort of high humidity environments. So hopefully it's a kind of self-cleaning as well. Yeah. It's all fingers crossed stuff, though. Yeah.
Get back to where you talked about automation. I think that might be a key to something, because we're talking about the hand is not touching the paper. I mean, when you manufacture the paper, there is no hand there or no hands there, and the mail room and the production is all automated. Should we be getting that out to the public somehow as an industry?
I think so. Yeah, I think where possible, people should make that point, that it's a fully automated industry, and And aside from a few, I mean, there's not been a lot of comment in the UK about. There's not been much concern around printed newspapers in the UK. But as and where we particularly our group, we have published in newspapers various bits and pieces surrounding the general safety of reading news on newspapers. Yeah. So I think it's up to each individual publishing house to push that information out, I think. Yeah.
Here's a question about there are no more printed newspapers in Morocco. The decision to cease printing comes within the safety measures. Is this the right decision?
Well, from my personal point of view, no, it isn't the right decision. But of course, we don't know the circumstances of that particular country. I would imagine if the government decided that they don't want to run the risk, then it's entirely up to the Moroccan government, I guess. From what I've just said, it seems highly unlikely that the virus could be spread by newspapers. Potentially, I guess, if one newspaper is read many times, there's probably a bigger chance of picking something up. But as has been said before, the newspapers themselves are pretty sterile when it comes to the ink on the surface, etc. So so it's not a it's a decision that I hope Morocco makes alone, actually, and we can continue reading newspapers. Yeah.
Here's a question also about the study you mentioned about the copper, and maybe we'll just get the reference, and if we send out an email then we could reference that in the email, because they're asking about the study that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Transmissibility.
Yeah, I can send you the detail of that paper. It's a research paper. Yeah.
Yep, I'll send that out. Here's another one about in most developing countries, the distribution process is not as automated as in the UK. So there's much more human interaction with paper and among workers. What could be the risks in such cases, both for readers and for the industry? There's obviously a concern about this.
Yeah, so I didn't get that. Are they saying the UK is not that automated?
Yeah, they're saying in other countries. They're probably talking about countries that have less automation than the UK and other more advanced printing companies, I guess.
Possibly. That might have been more true 30 years ago, but now if you look at modern newspaper production throughout the world, Asia, India, China, they have the most modern equipment available. So I think the majority of large operations will have very, very high levels of automation. Yeah.
Right. Here's one from the Italian government has classified newspapers as a basic necessity, enabling journalists to continue reporting, with print and distribution operations continuing. Are the UK newspaper publishers pushing the UK government for a similar accreditation?
I think we already have that accreditation. Yeah, that's already been agreed by the UK government that newspapers and journalism is a fundamental industry. Yeah, correct. Also tied in with democracy and freedom of speech, etc. I don't think Boris Johnson will be closing down newspapers as a response to the coronavirus. That's the last thing he'd want to do.
Do you have any information on related lockdowns in newsprint production? Producing regions of Europe, Canada, and Russia. Is that something you can share?
In terms of mill production?
Yeah, really lockdowns of newsprint producing. So probably lockdowns of news of mills, I guess.
No, there's none. I mean, I did a very quick check again this morning before we had this webinar, and all the people I've spoken to. Nobody, apart from the 2 or 3 instances I just mentioned, nobody's talked about any mills being out of action or locked out or locked down. There have been some comments about some South American South American construction sites have been affected, where they're building capacity. But in terms of current capacity operating, everything, I'm touching wood as I say this, everything is working.
Yeah. There are two schools of thought regarding inventory lately: to increase due to supply chain disruptions, or decrease, keep at the same level due to the drop in consumptions. What are your views on what most publishers would do?
What publishers should do?
Yeah, I mean, just talking about consumables. I mean, should you be hoarding consumable or just having them just in time like you did before? I think that's the question here.
Yeah, well, I think from our personal, I think in the situations where it's where there's uncertainty, and I think this is certainly a situation where there's a lot of uncertainty, I think it would be very sensible to build inventory as and where you have A, the financial ability to do it, and B, the physical space to do it. Most big printers and publishers are normally constricted by the amount of storage space they have to be able to build inventory up. And as I've said, if you take the UK as an example, and I think this is probably true of all of Western Europe at least, the inventory is pretty high in the mills. It's not excessively high, but it's good for this time of year. Most producers that export will have inventory in various places as well. So I think there's good inventory. But outside of that, there's always good sense to if you're able to financially to have as much inventory bought and in-house as possible, for sure. Yeah, and keep a watching eye on it. Obviously, when things ease up, we can reduce inventory back down again. But it's very few printers or publishers can actually build a lot of inventory because they're just confined by the space. I mean, paper itself, the paper reel itself is a big object, and to be able to store meaningful amounts of paper takes up a hell of a lot of volume and space. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Here's a small COVID question. Journalists can work from home, printers can't. All UK print plants are in lockdown. Any plants, to your knowledge, that have suffered from the virus among the printers? Are there any contingency print plans kicking in yet?
I think every publisher has got their contingency plans. We certainly have, whereby certain plants that print for us may have infections where we can move production around the country or other countries to meet the print demand. But as yet, from our point of view, we've not had to move anything around. So currently we have the plans. We've not had to use them yet, and I'm pretty sure that stands for most other UK publishers at the moment. Everybody's made plans, of course, and we hope that it doesn't come down to having to use them. But it remains to be seen. Yeah, but I think, as I say, all publishers have almost certainly gone through the discipline of working out disaster recovery plan, as we call it, for our production.
Here's another about the spreading of COVID. In the US, many newspapers are delivered in plastic bags. Could the virus be passed on via the plastic bag? I mean, is that a threat?
Well, that wouldn't surprise me. If you looked at, this, as I say, we'll give you the details of some of these research papers I've got here. But it shows that a lot of certain plastics and polymers, the virus can sit on the surface and be viable for much longer periods than cardboard or paper. So it's entirely possible that you could have viruses stuck on plastic. That's for sure. Yeah. I don't know if there's any evidence of people being infected by it, but in terms of the ability for the virus to stay viable on those surfaces. It certainly seems that they can stay active for longer on polymer than wood fiber. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There's also here some question about consumables that maybe you have an answer. If not, then okay. Has there been a reported shortage of solvents for the printing of newspapers as we're facing for packaging printing? Synthetic ethyl alcohol in flexo printing and isopropanol in offset, because these solvents are used as disinfectants as well. Have you experienced that?
Well, it's not my area. Certainly, I speak to our production people very often. They've not mentioned any shortfalls to me at all. One thing I will say I have picked up on from some of our ink suppliers that buy a lot of their precursors from China, and a lot of material does come from China, of course, particularly precursors such as alcohols and synthetic alcohols. And that is, at least from one of our suppliers, they've said that they now have the Chinese suppliers of precursors are now up and fully running again. So in terms of the ability to get material from China, they say that things have gone back to normal. So, but I've heard of it, certainly not with us or anybody else has mentioned the fact they can't get any solvents. So no, I've not heard that.
Okay, we only have a few minutes left, so if people want to post questions, by all means do, because we only have a few minutes left. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about how you see things developing in the next months, because I mean everybody has, there is no way to predict the future, but I mean, can you tell us a little bit how you can predict about how things might develop?
In terms of our industry, well, I mean, the big concerns, of course, are that how long this goes on for, because the longer it goes on for, the worse shape newspaper publishing will be in at the end of it. And you know, just looking at the free sheet business, it's the longer it goes on, the worse it's going to be. In terms of our paid for circulations, as I said to you, they're holding up, but circulation is only one aspect of it. If you look at the advertising income of newspapers, both provincial and national, it's not been decimated. It was decimated. It'll be only 10% reduction, but it's much more than 10% reduction in advertising. So newspapers themselves will critically be in trouble. You know, within weeks, or certainly if it lasts 6 weeks, most newspaper groups will be in serious trouble, I would say, financially. Yeah, because obviously the costs of newspapers as they stand at the moment have not gone down, but income through lack of less circulation, and more importantly, much lower print advertising income, it's going to force newspapers into some very serious situations sooner or later, I'd say. Actually, part of the newspaper business attraction is very cash generative, but that turnover can be very quickly impacted from one week to the next. So that's my primary concern. I'm sure all of the other senior publishers' concerns is that the longer this goes on, the worse it's going to be for everybody, but in particular these newspaper publishers as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you. There is one question here about the Daily Mail and Mail on Sunday. Do you see any lift in or higher sales numbers because people need more news in times of crisis?
I think we've seen some uptick over the last couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. I think that's safe to say that we've seen our sales go up slightly, certainly not go down, but a slight uptick. Obviously, the concern now in the UK is that with this much more comprehensive lockdown, that people are less likely or will find it more difficult to go out daily and buy a newspaper if the diktat is you're allowed to go out to exercise once, or you're allowed to go out once to buy food. That if you go to a place that doesn't sell newspapers, what do you do? So I think it's going to make it more difficult for people to sell newspapers. So whilst in the short term we've seen, you know, a relative sort of stable, slight uptick in newspaper purchasing, I think in the mid to long term it's going to tail off because people just can't get physically out to buy the product.
Right.
Yeah.
I hear you. I think there are we have finished all the questions that came into our questionnaire, and we're almost out of time, so we are actually in a great time as it is. I would like to thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome.
Dr. Stunt. And I would also like to thank Anton Tolkowsky, who assisted us in this production. We have a webinar next week at the same time. So we're, like I mentioned in the last webinar, we have a webinar every week now at 2 o'clock on Wednesdays, 2 o'clock Central Eastern Time. So everybody knows that, and we will have a webinar next week with production people from Singapore and from the US, just to let you know, and we'll keep you posted about that through our World Printers Forum newsletter. We will also put this up on YouTube very soon, and send you takeaways from what transpired in this webinar. So thank you so much for a good day and good webinar, and thanks again, Dr. Stunt.
Good, thank you. Thanks. Bye.